Good morning. My name is John Bambanek.
Здравствуйте.
Speak to you about domain generation algorithms and threat intelligence. So a little bit about myself. I am president of my own firm, Bambanek Consulting. I also teach for the Department of Computer Science at the University of Illinois in the United States. I produce some open source intelligence feeds. You'll see a link to that in the last slide. And I work with companies and law enforcement all over the world to address the growth of cybercrime. So about threat intelligence. There's a lot of misinformation about what this is, so I like at least defining what I believe it is before I talk about it. Information just generally is just a set of data. Many companies just call, hey, look at all these domains and IP addresses, no context, no nothing, call that threat intelligence. That's not really what threat intelligence is. Intelligence is the art, of critically examining information to produce some actionable conclusions based on that. So there's a very defined process that goes about that, and I'll talk a little bit about that as I go through how I use DGAs. Okay. I said many companies just dump, here's 7 million IP addresses that do bad things. That's just information. That's not really intelligence. But there's very few that actually process that to create meaningful information. So the important point of that is that intelligence involves analyzing your adversary capabilities, their intentions and motivations, and that lets you tell something about what they're doing and what they will do, and that's where some real value is. Okay. So why does all of this matter? Okay. Reverse engineering, malware, you can find a DGA, resolve all of that, might give you some useful information. It is useful. But knowing why they're making those decisions can give you some more valuable insight into, what to block, why to block, and exactly what's going on inside of an organization. And the importance is to be able to distinguish between, the small amount of signal and the large amount of noise that's out there. If you're monitoring firewall logs, you're going to see things scanning and hitting an organization all the time. That doesn't necessarily mean you've got an advanced threat or something sophisticated. That's just a lot of noise. The idea is to find the little bits of signal in all of that data to find some real use. So adversarial objectives, here when we're talking about domain generation algorithms, is generally a crime focused. It's not really used in APTs or nation state or espionage stuff. It's usually a crime domain. So you have somebody that's usually financially motivated. That's their driving conclusion. So some things that you already know about them is that you're dealing with highly rational actors. That what they do it for some defined reason, some defined objective, that they made an intelligent choice. As many of you probably know, organized crime is very hierarchical and organized, very potentially siloed, where, there's people who do software development, people who do money laundering, and so on and so forth. Many of these organizations will hire outside experts, for lack of a more appropriate word. They may not have all the capabilities in-house. And the last two kind of important points is that criminal actors have a desire to remain quiet. They tend not to want to advertise that they've owned something, and they want to remain resilient over the long term. They want to avoid law enforcement or companies being able to disrupt their activities so they can keep the flow of fraud going over long periods of time. Okay. So a little bit about the history of malware command and control networks. Over the last, 10, 15, some odd years. I said an adversary would like to persist their infections and the number of victims over the long term and make their networks more resilient. So that's how they evolved over time. Domain names generally tend to be easier to take down than IP addresses, even despite jurisdictional boundaries. So that has an effect in how they've made choices over time. And like I said, the development over time will largely show this, that they've acted in ways to ensure increased resiliency. And we can map forward over time, map forward into the future about how they're likely to change their tactics over the coming years. So in the beginning, malware actors would have static IP addresses and domains in there. Here's 3, 5, 7, sometimes even just one IP address or domain name says, okay, here's how I want to be reached. Like I said, domains are easy to take down, so IP addresses happen to be used, and IP addresses, because of jurisdictional issues, it tends to be more difficult to take those down. So various countries will not work with other law enforcement, or are less likely to work with law enforcement from other countries. So that allows command and control to persist even when everybody kind of knows where they're operating. So because of this, adversarial response has increased numbers of domains and IP addresses, and used service providers, depending on who their victims are, that are more likely to not respond to victim nations saying, hey, there's a problem here, do something about it. So the more domains you have, early on it tend to be more difficult to take things down. Okay. Kind of the next evolution is the use of proxies. So you have a domain and IP address, that's where the victim's called to, and that simply just sends the traffic somewhere else. So that makes it difficult. So if you were able to seize a machine, all you're really doing is seizing a proxy. You're not really getting much information. It would still be disruptive to a botnet, its command and control mechanism. So, but it tended, security companies and law enforcement tended to be more leery of actually taking action at this point, because you weren't getting all of the data that you'd really want, how many people were compromised, what information was compromised. So they'd be less likely to take over proxies aside of an attempt to find what was behind it. So our response as security companies, law enforcement, were to stop doing takedowns as much. Because the most valuable information was transparent, or was hidden to our immediate view. Kind of the next stage of evolution is the use of dynamic DNS. So noip3322.org, several different providers of that. This basically allows people to register, have a fixed host name to an IP address that changes rapidly over time. The service was tended to be used more for, or at least at its conception, was used for consumers who had residential IP addresses that would change frequently, so it'd have some way to contact to their home PC. But organized crime actors found that this was fairly useful for their use as well. It's still being used today, even though it's a fairly well-known tactic. Remote access tools, script kiddies tend to use it, but there is some kind of APT espionage actors who do use this as well. So this is still, even though it's been around for a while, it's still very active. Fast flux, domains using multiple A records with short time to live to create rolling lists of usually proxies, but not always, to maintain control. So given one host name, you'd see 10, 50, 100, possibly nodes that would usually proxy back somewhere else. So it started to make it increasingly difficult to take down these machines. So you could seize a machine, the victim will happily move on because you can simply update DNS. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes there'd be defined fast flux networks that be reused and sold out. But many times it'd also be just compromised machines. So you could take an action, hey, this machine is in this fast flux network doing criminal things, and it's really just somebody's home PC that was compromised with something else. So this is another way to, one, maintain resilience, but to further obfuscate the individual behind it and keep the data that they want to protect private. So here's a very quick example. You see 5 IP addresses, or I should say, 5 IP addresses that point to one host name with a 30-minute time to live. So even though those A records are still resilient, is that I could take down those 5 IP addresses. 30 minutes later, there's 5 more IP addresses in their place. If I took down the domain, I would just, assuming there's only one, if I took down the domain or the name servers, it would still, catastrophically disrupt the botnet. Okay. So to evolve past that, there was double flux. So it added the same same tactic for name servers. So it made their controlling services more resilient too. So I couldn't just take over their name servers. I'd have to do something else to take them down. However, the domains, was still controlling. So if I can go to a registrar and take out dive with sharks, then everything is offline. So as an example, Again, 15-minute time to live here probably. Wait a little bit, and the IP addresses change. Okay. The important note of that is while the IP addresses change frequently, if you seized the domain because the registrar was cooperative or you took some legal action, you would still disrupt the botnet. You might not recover the data, but no future loss would occur. Okay. A fairly recent development is the introduction of Tor and I2P. So these privacy-enhancing technologies, particularly the hidden services component of it. So using these anonymization networks where it hides where the infrastructure actually is. So probably the most famous or well-known example of this is Silk Road, which is kind of an online black market that was eventually taken down by U.S. law enforcement. That operated on a hidden service, so there was no domain name to seize. They made their mistake of that they leaked out information that it made law enforcement able to identify where the infrastructure actually was, and that operator made other mistakes which made it possible to identify who he was. But generally speaking, without some kind of mistake, they're very hard to disrupt and take down. Even today, there's really no good tactic I can point to you that if somebody's using Tor or I2P for criminal operations of what to do to disrupt them, aside of blocking them. Now that said, most organizations, companies, and institutions could simply just block the use of Tor I2P. That really won't help consumers, but it'll certainly help organizations because in very rare circumstances is there really a legitimate business use for the use of Tor inside of a company. But it's still something that can't really be used to protect consumers. Okay. And the last iteration of evolution is domain generation algorithms. And DGAs basically are just a complicated math algorithm that creates pseudo-random but predictable domain names. So runs through some function based on whatever criteria it's given and says here's 100,000, 10,000 domain names that will be searched to see if any one of them is a botnet controller. So instead of a static list, something with fast flux, something where there's a defined small set of things you could take action against, now you have a somewhat dynamic list of hundreds or thousands of domains that could operate under a variety of registrars, a variety of top-level domains, and the adversary only needs to register a couple at a time. So, usually most of these things that use DGAs will kind of go through in sequence and say, okay, I've authenticated this one as my controller, now I don't need to keep searching. If things go offline because of a seizure, it simply just goes, iterates through the list again, and from there waits for another valid hit, whatever the malware family defines as a valid hit. So this would allow an adversary to shop registrars, domain registrars, and TLDs for that matter, to find somebody who's more friendly to their operation, or I should say, less willing to work with authorities. So, if GoDaddy, for instance, is suspending all their domains, they can go shop to another domain registrar. Okay. And of course, malware C2s can use a variety of these tactics, and actually many of the more sophisticated ones do use a variety of static list, domain generation algorithms in Tor and I2P, so that if any particular ones of these are disabled or blocked, they're still able to reassert control and, for that matter, update themselves or update their victims with better control code or new control code to avoid the tactics that law enforcement and security companies are doing to disrupt their activities. Okay. So reverse engineering domain generation algorithms. There are a lot of posts out there. This talk isn't really about reversing it so much. But if you take a look at Johannes Bader's blog, johannesbader.ch, he's got somewhere between a half dozen and a dozen DGAs reverse engineered, and he shows how he goes about doing that and provides usually Python code to basically provide command line ability to run DGAs. So if you're interested in that, I highly recommend his blog. If you are reverse engineering it in a malware sample, there's really no shortcuts to it, but there are a couple of things to look for. Is looking for functions that iterate many times. So, there'll be some function that says, okay, go through, generate 1,000 domains. It gives you kind of a visual cue to look for. And then there'll be some connecting function. Hey, try to connect to these in sequence. So that lets you know at least this is probably in the ballpark of what you're looking for. That being said, of course, any malware, particularly the more sophisticated the malware is, the more likely there is to be obfuscation and anti-debugging techniques that'll make life difficult for you. Okay. So as an example, which is probably not entirely visible on this slide, but from a disassembled IDA, you see the DGA of Rambius right there. Okay. So there are several different types of DGAs. All of them use some kind of seed, pseudo-random seed to generate the list. Many tend to be date-based, so based on whatever day, whatever calendar day it is, they'll generate a given list of domains. Some will have simply a static seed that says, okay, here's the 1,000 domains generated based on this defined string, whether it's a 4-byte string or some other domain name. And then there's also been the emergence of the use of dynamic seeds. The seed has to be globally consistent. So it has to be something that makes sense to anybody anywhere in the world, so that when a victim machine initiates the algorithm to run the DGA, all victims have to be able to run whatever code to do the DGA. It has to be predictable so that whoever operates the network knows what to register and that all the victims will reliably connect to it. Some other hardening techniques that they've taken using domain generation algorithms is, obviously the easy one is using whois protection. Many will do whois protection, though an important point, at least I've noticed, is that there are several registrars who, while they offer whois protection, there will still be unique strings that will help you correlate whoever the registrant is to other things that they've registered. So there may be a custom email address. It's not valid for anything, but it'll help you register, okay, this actor registered these other domains that may or may not be in the DGA. Some global top-level domains don't offer whois protection. You may or may not be able to get away with putting in fake whois information. But there are several GTLDs that really make it difficult for people who want to do sinkholes. So there's a couple of campaigns that use DGAs that have specifically gravitated towards those GTLDs simply to make research hard for people who look into things. Several malware campaigns will also rotate their seeds somewhat frequently, as long as they're still in control of their victims and are able to update all of their victims. That's not a very difficult thing to do. They just communicate the new seed to everybody and they move on. Tiny Banker is very notorious for this. And there's been emergence, maybe in the last several months, is that some malware tries to be sinkhole aware, where explicitly it looks before it connects to an IP address to say, hey, this isn't really mine. This belongs to a security researcher. So, their adversarial objective here: maintain control and limit surveillance. So again, adversaries taking action, highly rational action based on whatever their particular objectives are. Okay, take a look at a couple of DGAs really quickly. The first is Conficker, seen around 2007. Even though that Conficker is, I don't want to say dead and gone, the control of Conficker infected nodes is gone, but there's still about 700,000 machines still infected with Conficker. They're essentially just zombies who are just connecting outward and never getting anything. The first two iterations of Conficker, A and B, generated only 250 domain names. Early on is that security companies started registering them, sinkholing them, taking down domains. So whoever was behind Conficker upped the number of domains in a DGA up to 50,000 across 140 global TLDs. So they had quite the selection in terms of choosing how to maintain control. There was a couple of registries that started banning the use of configured domains. So now using 140 global TLDs, it allowed them to go around that problem and still maintain control. There we go. So, second example is CryptoLocker, generated 1,000 domains a day across 7 GTLDs. CryptoLocker was active in 2013 and 2014. It was very similar to the domain generation algorithm that's listed in the Wikipedia article on DGAs. So if you Google domain generation algorithm, the example that they provide there, that code, only a couple small changes, and it's the same as the CryptoLocker code, which amused me when I was researching it. It was used previously in 2011 by the Flashback OS X worm, which was a Mac virus. So one of the interesting things in researching and investigating this is, okay, a DGA based on, or a DGA that was previously used in a Mac campaign, now being used in Windows, kind of gave the impression that, there's somebody out there who's selling this stuff, because the people who write Mac malware are not the same people who would write Windows malware, generally speaking. But somebody who knows a lot about DGAs, which is a very small subset of people, could simply reuse the code. So I believe there's kind of a small marketplace of people out there who do nothing but write domain generation algorithms. Through the life of CryptoLocker, in about 9 or 10 months, there was never any change in the malware campaign, in the DGA itself. So despite the fact that early on the British government has one registry for all of co.uk, early on they simply blocked all the co.uk domains. The actors behind CryptoLocker never changed tactics, even though that we were onto them, and it was pretty well known that we were onto them. And this was successfully taken down in 2014. That takedown basically involved simply just registering and taking all of the domains that CryptoLocker would use well into the future. So they only had one method to reach out and it was the DGA. They never changed it. There was no update mechanism. So they were able to take it out by simply just seizing a few 100,000 domains. So some conclusions about this. I already mentioned one. I think it was likely written by a third party. It would go days without an active domain registration. So the actor behind it wanted to get paid, but really wasn't overly concerned about, I need to make sure this is up 24/7, and didn't really tend to it. It was very casual maintenance of the network. He tended not to shift registrars even when domains are suspended. So there's a couple of times he kept going back to the same registrar even though we were able to take down his domains. And he didn't really monitor his own network, because security researchers, for those 1,000 domains that were generated today, for every one active malicious C2 IP address, there's about 125 sinkholes. So we were, obviously very flagrant in monitoring that. Next example is Timba. Already mentioned it a little bit. Generates 1,000 domains a day. It is not date seeded, so it's basically in effect a static list seeded by an initial host name and a defined GTLD. So you'd say, .org and then some host name, and then it would iterate through its algorithm. This one's interesting because of all the malware families that I track using DGAs, this one changes the most frequent, usually about a couple of times a week. And usually almost as soon as somebody cracks it and starts sinkholing it, they start moving and updating everybody, all their victims. So there's somebody very active trying to prevent surveillance. So conclusions about Timba. Timba, also known as Tiny Banker. They care about their infrastructure, and they're very active in trying to limit the amount of surveillance that people can take on them. Okay. Last example is BDeep, which uses a dynamic seed. This uses currency exchange values as published by the European Central Bank. The European Central Bank daily generates basically a text file with values of the exchange rates between various currencies. So this malware reaches out to the European Central Bank, figures that out, and uses that as the seed to generate domains. So this makes it impossible to predict in advance what domains there'll be. you'll have it for a given day, but you can't map forward what they're going to use. So I found this a very interesting use of foreign exchange values, but an attempt to really stay ahead of us, because now there's no way to predict in the future what domain something's going to use. And there's a blog post on there from Arbor Networks if you want to read more about that. Okay? So all successful takedowns of malware that uses DGAs generally involved seizing all of the domains in advance and suspending current domains. So obviously, if I can't predict in the future what somebody's going to use, I can't really take it down. Okay? Now, this would decapitate a botnet if and only if there was no other fallback mechanism. So many of these malware campaigns that I've gone through, the DGA may not be the primary or may not even be the secondary. There's Tor and I2P or static lists. So in this example with BDeep, you can't really do any takedown activity against it, at least not the way that we've been doing it over the past couple of years. So that talks a little bit about why DGAs are good for the bad guys. Let's talk about why DGAs, are good for the good guys. Since there is some predictable pattern, at least for a given day of DGAs, that allows us to create sinkholes that get some additional information. Essentially register a domain inside of a DGA and then and let victims connect to us. So, it allow the creation of signatures or traffic patterns that would allow some blocking or at least some detection of a malware infection. Okay, it does provide some easy ability to do takedowns if you can predict the domains in advance. So, Operation Tovar, which took down CryptoLocker and Game Over Zeus, both of those only used a DGA mechanism. We were able to register 6 months worth of domains and essentially decapitate both families at once. And more the point of this talk is it provides some interesting ability to surveil malicious infrastructure in relative near time. Okay. The use of DNS, limits the ability, of the adversary to play games. And what I mean by this is, you want your victims to be able to connect to you. You may not know exactly who your victims are. So if you're using DNS of a host name, you really can't do any games to deceive people or deceive researchers from figuring out where you are, because you want your victims to be able to connect to you. So the entire world needs to be able to reliably resolve your IP address. Okay? So even when, and then the second point is, even when adversaries tend to change their domain generation algorithm, they tend not to immediately change the underlying IP addresses that they're using, at least not at the same time. So if you go back to the Tiny Bank or Tinba example, they may change their DGA, update all of their victims, but they're not updating the IP addresses at the same time. So at least gives you some hints to be able to go back and say, okay, they've changed their DGA, but here's still where their infrastructure is, and you could use maybe passive DNS to figure out what domains they're using and maybe help speed up reverse engineering of the DGA. So a little bit about sinkholing. Obviously many security companies do this. For some particular reason, many are very passionate about hiding that their IP address is in fact a sinkhole. I find this kind of ironic because most malware authors, I would think, would know what IP addresses they're using. So anything that's answering in their DGA that's not them is obviously a security company. But many will passionately try to avoid saying, no, I don't want to have anybody know that that's a sinkhole. But as an industry, we get kind of excessive about sinkholing. And CryptoLocker is a great example. 125 domains, for every one malicious domain. In fact, for some malware campaigns where the malware author has already updated their DGA and moved on, there are companies that will go back and sinkhole old DGAs simply because they finally got around to reverse engineering it, and they're not getting any reliable information out of it. There we go. All right. So if you know what domain somebody's using, you can create some feeds pretty easily out of it, to create some protective technology if you want. So here's an example of creating simply a feed for May 22nd of CryptoLocker. Not particularly useful because CryptoLocker is no more, but you can generate a list of domains, and then you could feed that into RPZ or some other tool to simply block access to it. The rest of the world might be able to reach the malicious infrastructure, but whatever organization you're protecting wouldn't be able to reach it. So that's fairly easy to do, okay? But what's more interesting to me is the ability to do surveillance. So fairly easy to do this on a relatively small Amazon AWS instance. It requires two tools, Parallel and ADNS tools for asynchronous DNS lookups. So, it would start by, so the general process is you pre-generate all your domains 2 days before to 2 days later, and this assumes a date seeded DGA. So you generate all the domains that you want to look up. You take that list, you pipe it into ADNS, and use Parallel to limit the number of lines, about 500 to 1,000. If you fire more than that at once, you start getting unreliable results. And this allows you to basically get IP addresses in near real time. And for, I think roughly I'm processing around 200,000 domains now, and that can work inside of 10 minutes. So, as an example, here I should say here's one of the seeds of Tinba. So these are active non-sinkhole domains that are currently resolving. So you've got 7 of them. Well, we already know how to generate the domains. But what's interesting is getting the IP addresses. So those 7, or some of those domains will resolve to these IP addresses, at this given time. So a quick note about intelligence bias. When people gather intelligence and process information, they bring some biases to the table. The way I go about this is that I prune all sinkholes because I don't really care what security company is sinkholing what, because I'm interested in surveilling malicious infrastructure. So I'm generally uninterested in that. However, if you're protecting an organization, there's a company that you want to, protect, you would care about sinkholes, because if you've got a victim machine that's connecting to a sinkhole, it's still infected with something. It may not be really reaching the malicious infrastructure, but you still got something to clean up. So there's certainly some considerations of bias that you need to be involved with. So one quick point about this IP address list. It seems like, okay, I've got 6 IP addresses. I know they're resolved to malicious domains register those IP addresses. Okay, let's just go put that in a firewall and be done with it. It's generally not a good idea, and we'll talk about that in a couple of slides. This is probably not entirely visible to you, but you could also check name server information. So these are the 6 IP addresses, or 6 of the IP addresses for name servers that are used by Tiny Banker, and these are 4 of host names that are used to those. So with those 2 data points, you can usually quickly validate what's a sinkhole and what's more likely malicious. So some security companies will simply use a name server that has sinkhole in the title. That makes it obvious. But malicious actors tend to reuse the same name servers even when they change their DGAs. So it gives you some quick indication of how to validate quickly what's malicious and what's not malicious. So with those 4 data points, host name, or I should say domain, IP address, name server, IP address, name server, domain, you could start to make decisions based on that information. You could block those domains and IP addresses, and we'll talk more about that in a second. You could block the name servers. Anybody reaching out to the name servers? Sometimes DGA actors and malicious individuals will use otherwise legitimate name servers, and there's been more than a few security companies that have simply used a name server and correlated everything and created some false conclusions based simply on the use of a name server. So while it's not really useful operationally, it may be useful for intelligence. So, we've talked a little bit about what we're doing, but the adversaries know that we're doing this too. So this is not particularly sophisticated. It's pretty easy to do DNS lookups. So in response to us doing this, they'll change their seeds frequently. We talked about that. They do have non-DGA communication mechanisms, use of Tor or static lists or whatever. And the last one, which is somewhat recently, and what I find one of the most interesting, is engaging in counterintelligence. So briefly, counterintelligence is any set of tactics used by somebody to thwart information gathering on itself. So nation states and intelligence organizations do this all the time. It would make sense that organized crime actors would do the same. So you remember those domain and IP address lists before? What if an adversary registers domains that they aren't really using? Okay, maybe there's no real harm in that. But how about something a little bit more scary? And you probably can't see these IP addresses, but remember that the DGA is fully known by an adversary. The domains can be fully in the control of an adversary. They can point the resolution anywhere they want. Most malware is smart enough to distinguish between this really is a controller and it's not. So even if something connects to something, if their victim machine connects to an IP address that's not a controller, there's really no harm to them. So these 13 IP addresses point to the DNS root servers. So all 13 DNS root servers. If I were a bad person and wanted to screw with a security company that mindlessly took IP addresses from malicious domains and threw them into a firewall, I'd put these in there because you would break DNS for an organization completely and they would be down. And adversaries have done similar, not exactly this, but similar things where it says, okay, somebody is surveilling my DGA, so I'm going to put IP addresses that will start breaking things. So I thought that was a particularly interesting development. Okay. This brings me to a point to where I started, is that if you're taking information simply based on information without any real analysis, that could be catastrophic for an organization. And that's especially true when an adversary is 1, highly rational, 2, highly sophisticated, and 3, knows what you're doing. As security companies and researchers, most of everything that we do is out in the open and easy to determine by adversaries. So this is why, the act of intelligence, is so important. You could block those domain names. Okay, that's not really a problem. There's nothing really, no collateral damage to be had there. But IP addresses under the control of adversaries, they can start manipulating you. Okay. So at least in my feeds, I've whitelisted the root servers and a couple of other IP addresses after I noticed some adversarial action along those lines. Okay. Some who is intel. Often actors reuse some of the same information across different campaigns. So it makes it easy to correlate campaigns and correlate to other activities that somebody does. And I mentioned this a little bit earlier, is that there are some registrars that while they offer whois protection, they create a unique string that allows you to map the same actor. You may not know who they really are, but you can map the same actor to other domains, even though they're all under whois protection. Okay? So the reason this is important is almost every successful criminal prosecution or law enforcement operation is due to some kind of operational security screw-up that an adversary did, where there was possible to correlate domains back 4 or 5 years, and 4 or 5 years ago they registered a domain with their actual name that allowed somebody to take legal action against them. So that ability to do correlation backwards has proven very helpful, because almost always, given enough time, even a highly rational criminal actor will generally screw up. Okay. So we've talked a little bit about surveillance, and that's nice. But creation of feed data and intake of it into firewalls or intrusion detections is still generally a passive tactic. What about something a little bit more active? Is it possible to simply notify on changes so that you could take more, get to more proactive action? Okay, so possible to simply automate notifications when there's key changes that happen in terms of new domains being registered or new IP addresses being used. So for this, I use an application called Pushover. It's available on Google and Apple stores. It has a very simple API where you pass a key in whatever message, and it'll push out a notification to your phone. So in this example, it's a new dire domain registered. Here's the domain, the IP address, and what country it resolves to. So if I were interested in this, I could turn around and take some action or investigation on this. Now, I know this is interesting because the DGA that I'm using for dire right now, the actors have moved off of it for a couple of months. This is actually just a security company registering a sinkhole 3 months after the DGA has already changed. Here's something a little bit more malicious. MATSNU, which is a word-based DGA, so it uses a date seed and a list of words to create something that actually looks like it possibly could be a legitimate domain. So term-spread-medicine. So there was 3 domains registered roughly at the same time, or I should say 3 domains that resolved roughly at the same time. You know, here's 3 IP addresses, name servers match. Well, here's independence.com, maps to the United States using a commodity DNS server. So in this particular case, I can look fairly quickly and say, you know what, these are my 2 bad domains. This one, because it's a word-based DGA, every now and then there's collision with something that actually is legitimate and already exists. You know, this one is a collision. And another interesting data point here is that even though these 2 were registered at the same time, they're using 2 different registrars. So this is a malicious actor who is kind of diversifying what they're doing to be a little bit more resilient. Okay. So as you saw, you know, there's 2 new domains here, Fancastar and SeedWisdom. So based on those 2, I can kind of pivot off of those and see what also is served on those name servers to find additional intelligence. You know, caution is due. That may not always yield results and certainly can yield false positives. You know, there's something that I'm tracking right now involving commodity rats and various crimeware. The name server used by that points to an Iranian hosting company. You know, being United States based, anything Iran right now tends to get people's fur up in the US. But in that case, it just happened to be an Iranian hosting provider. There are several security companies that turn around and said, oh, look, this is Iranian nation state based stuff. No, this is just somebody using an Iranian hosting company because that would be somebody who would, you know, make some bad judgment about it and get egg on their face. So kind of as a caveat there, always correlate with something else. Don't ever rely on one piece of information to make a conclusion. Okay? As kind of a last adversarial response, I mentioned a little bit earlier, starting to see sinkhole-aware malware. It's very crude and rudimentary right now, where basically it goes through the DGA, attempts to resolve it, and looks for indications of, oh, this domain has some sinkhole, has the name sinkhole in its name server. I'm just not going to connect to it at all. Many sinkholes will also include HTTP headers that say x-sinkhole : true, something along the lines that advertise themselves. So malware is starting to be developed that will simply avoid that to bypass those sinkholes altogether, which would take away our ability to do some intelligence on that. So yeah, I thought that was a fairly interesting development. All right. So what will the future hold? You know, DGAs are going to be around for a while. I don't see them going away anytime soon, but they'll often be paired with something else to allow for communication. So it'll be DGAs and Tor, or DGAs and I2P, or DGAs and static lists, because at least the last several successful takedowns have simply just seized all the domains at once, decapitated it, and that was that. I certainly think Tor will continue to be used because it has some very strong advantages for criminal actors. Even though it's fairly easy to block its use inside of an organization, you know, there's still some great advantages it could have to the actor, namely that it makes it very difficult. I don't ever want to say anything's impossible, but very difficult to identify where the infrastructure actually is. And there's been a couple of novel and interesting techniques to try to identify that and ultimately haven't panned out. So at this point, we're kind of, unless there's some other operational security mistake, there's no good way to identify where a Tor or I2P hidden service is. And it will, there'll be an increase in the use of interesting dynamic seeds. So I mentioned BDEEP, which uses the European central banks' foreign exchange values which is fairly new, and that was a fairly interesting thing. I certainly think that kind of development will happen where there'll be some kind of seed that's used where it's only valid for a given day, and there's no predictability going forward, which would also severely hamper any kind of enforcement action that we would take on it. Okay. So, end of my presentation. Thank you. The link right there is a list of the various feeds that I produce, if anybody is interested in using them and taking a look. And are there any questions? There's a microphone there.
Hello, thank you for the presentation. I wanted to ask a question regarding decentralized systems which I'm interested in. For example, Namecoin, which is a Bitcoin fork that allows for a fully decentralized key value store, which is used for maintaining a decentralized domain name system, which I can and traditional domain registrators cannot control. So is it used in malware, and are other Bitcoin-related technologies used there? For example, you mentioned using European bank exchange rates as a seed. Mm-hmm. For example, the malware could use Bitcoin block hashes as seeds, which are also unpredictable, mm-hmm. but which are impossible to take down. Thank you.
So I guess there's two parts to that question. The first is the use of decentralized name services, and is it used? Certainly not popularly. Most of the mainline malware I'm tracking don't use it. I don't think I've seen anything proof of concept that uses it yet. And the second is the use of Bitcoin indicators as a dynamic seed. Really, I think the first mainline attempt to use a dynamic seed was BDeep. So I think as long as it's something that could be accessed statically easy, then I think it could be used. I think the problem that you would, if I were a criminal picking a dynamic seed, the problem of using anything within Bitcoin, you'd probably have to download the entire blockchain to get that information, would you? I don't confess great.
You can just query a specialized web server.
Oh, okay, you can query it then. Then, yeah, I see no reason that it could be used. The concern with querying anything outward is that while it makes it hard to take down domains in the future, it certainly produces some additional intelligence because all of a sudden, you've got 1 million people querying the same thing when it's normally a small amount. But I don't see any reason why that couldn't be used. Okay. Other questions? Yes, no? All righty. Well, thank you and enjoy the rest of your conference.